Hello and welcome to a new episode of Coffee with Thorben. Today, not with coffee, but just with a glass of water, and you probably already hear it with a slightly different sound setup. The reason is that my microphone just died a few minutes ago, and I have no clue why. Well, the nice things of working with software and in IT in general, right? I mean, I did all the typical stuff that we as IT professionals do, like restarting Windows, unplugging and plugging the microphone in again, and all these kind of things. It just doesn't work. So I hope that you can hear me at least okay with this new setup. And until next time, I will try to hopefully get the old microphone back to working again, and if not, to find a different approach. Let's see. So yeah, I hope all of you are fine. Jens, thanks for pointing out that the old rate screen is still up here on YouTube. Yeah, that will be fixed in a bit, I hope. It's definitely on my list, and I hope I can do that, let's say, over the weekend, most likely. Sound is perfect. That's great. Yeah, today with the microphone that I normally use for the regular YouTube videos. Let's see how that goes. Okay. Let's take a look at the chat and start with Shift's question there. How to keep each update of the entity history in table? That sounds like a question about Hibernate Envers. Hibernate Envers is an extension of Hibernate that basically adds an audit log to your application. Let me check if I have an example of that right here that I can show you. Do I have one? No, it doesn't look like I have it in this project. But you can take a look at the blog. There you will find a few posts about Hibernate Envers. So the great thing there is the only thing you need to do is you need to add a dependency to Hibernate Envers to your project and annotate your entity with add audited. And that's basically it. Hibernate will then write a record to the audit table for each change that you perform on that entity. At least as long as you change the entity object itself so that it goes through the typical Hibernate lifecycle, because Hibernate Envers basically adds a set of lifecycle listeners that then take care of the update. Yeah, and then you also get a query API that is similar to the JPA criteria API, and that enables you to either check the history of a specific object and go through the changes in time that were performed on that object, or you can use a horizontal slice from your audit to perform a query on the data that was valid, let's say last Monday. Yeah, so for these kind of things, please take a look at Hibernate Envers. It's specifically designed for these kind of operations. Okay. Then I prepared a few questions here on Stack Overflow and on the blog, and yeah, I will go through them. In the meantime, if you have any questions about these questions that I'm working on or about any other JPA or Hibernate thing, feel free to post it in the chat, and then I will do my best to answer it. Okay, must I create a mapping change my setup here real quick. Yeah, that's better. So the question is, must I create a mapping relationship between two entities in Hibernate? For example, if you have an order table in Hibernate and a product table that receives an order, is mapped as a one-to-many relationship, then code here needs to be a mapping relationship. There's nothing else to except delete cascade. Well, in general, if you want to work with associations between your entities, then you need to model them in your domain model. That means in this case, you would model it what is it? A product and an order. So you would at least model it on the order side as a many-to-one association to the is it a many-to-one? One-to-many? Shouldn't that be a many-to-many association in general? I mean, an order probably contains more than one product. And a product can definitely be part of more than one order, at least I hope. Otherwise, the store would probably be in trouble. But anyways, yeah, you would model it on at least one entity, and then you can use it in your business code to traverse the association in your queries, to join using these modeled associations, and you could also implement a delete cascade as asked here by Everspring. So Hopcroft asked in the chat, which approach is better? What does it mean with which approach? What are the options I can choose between? Okay, let me quickly answer this one. If you want to use an association in your business code, you also need to model it in your domain model. In the described example, I would expect many-to-many association between the order and the, what is the other thing? The product entity. You could model it as a uni or bidirectional association. Okay, this example, so we would have public class order, and then private set products, and there would be a many-to-many association, and public class product, many-to-many mapped by products, private set, what's it called? Orders. Okay. Okay, so let's take a question, look at the question from Hopcroft in the chat. Okay, so we have entity manager, get transaction begin, some code, get transaction commit, or so the Hopcroft, what is the question here? So is the question if you should always start a transaction before you do anything with Hibernate, or is there another question? If the question is if you should always start a transaction and commit it at the end, then in few words, get new transaction versus using current transaction. Well, that depends on what you want to do. So in general, you should perform all operations with Hibernate within a transaction, because otherwise Hibernate will start a transaction auto-commit mode for each SQA statement it sends to the database. And that means the database has to start a transaction before it executes the SQA statement, and it commits it afterwards. And that means we have lots of small transactions, and these cause a lot of load on the database because the commit log needs to be written to the disk, and that's a pretty expensive operation. So in the end, it's better to always start a transaction before you do something, and then, well, before you do one or more operations, and then start it after you processed everything that should be part of your transaction. And that is the second question. What should be part of your current transaction? Well, in general, you should use as few transactions as possible. And that usually means that most use cases just use one transaction. The question there is, should all the operations that you perform be part of a logical unit? Do you want atomicity for all these operations? Which means, do you want to make sure that either all of them or none of them get committed? That's the case for most record-centric operations. That might not be the case for batch operations. That might be totally fine to split the whole thing into multiple batches of 100 records each, and then you start the transaction, process the 100 records, and then you commit it, and then you start with the next batch. That totally depends on your use case and the let's say the overall granularity of the operations and groups of operations that you want to perform. Yeah, so without taking a look at a specific use case, it's hard to answer. As I said, it totally depends on what you want to do there. But as a general rule, please always start a transaction before you perform your first operation with Hibernate, and then do as much as possible within that one transaction before you commit it. Abdel Fadale asks, I have this error when I read from database MySQL exception, out of memory error thrown from uncaught exception handler in thread file watcher. Well, that's probably a database issue. There you would need to check your database logs. I at least have no clue why Hibernate should have a file watcher. So yeah, that's probably an error that happens on the database itself, and that you just then get as an SQL exception from a persistence layer. So sorry, no clue what's going on there. Yes, Abdel Fadel, yes, it might be that, well, you're using Hibernate and JPA, that's totally fine, but it it looks like the error isn't caused by your Java application, it's caused on the database side. So you need to analyze what's going on the database and why it throws the exception. But well, that's only a guess. I mean, I just see the type of the exception here. It's just not enough information to really dive into the details. But based on the stuff that you posted here, I would say that isn't a Hibernate issue because there is no thread file watcher. That's probably part of the database, I guess. I don't know. Or it's a thread that you created and then you would need to dive deeper into what's going on within that thread. But neither the out-of-memory error nor the uncaught exception handler are part of Hibernate, so there's probably something else going on. Okay, Shiv asked the best way to perform the soft delete for the entity. Yeah, you can do Google search on that, and you will find an article in which I describe that in great details. The general idea is that you can use I think the annotations are called update and delete, and they enable you to, well, you can put them on an entity class and they allow you to define the update and the remove SQL statement that Hibernate will use. So if you want to do a soft delete, you would annotate your class, entity class, with the delete annotation and override Hibernate's default SQL statement with an update statement that changes the state of the record. So you need an additional column in that database table that stores the actual status of the record, and you then set it to removed. And in all queries, you then exclude all removed entities. You can either do that in the query itself, or you can add the thing called a Hibernate filter that then automatically excludes all entities in the state removed. Yeah, that's the general idea. So instead of removing the records from your database, you're just changing the status of the record itself, and you can do that by using this delete annotation and providing your SQL update statement, and then you exclude these records from all your queries, for example, with the Hibernate filter. As I said, if you do a quick Google search on that, you will find an article in which I describe that in way more detail. Okay, let me take a last quick look here at the query, and then we go to the next one, at the question here, if you want to use it. Okay. Let me get another link to for the article. That is. For example, I provide a very detailed description of all kinds of associations in this article, and guide to association mappings. And add the link here and post. Okay. Yeah, so next one is a question from the blog. And this one is about the author underscore class. So let's scroll up a little bit. So this is a Hibernate tip in which I use the criteria query, which is, you can see the example of it here, which is JPA's API that you can use to dynamically create queries. That's often used if the user can provide lots of different search criteria that you need to apply to your query. And then you can use the criteria API to dynamically decide which tables do you need, or which entities do you need to join, which entity attribute should be part of the where clause, and so on. And the criteria API can be used to create type-safe queries. And if you do that, then you use these underscore classes. Let me show an example of that in the IDE. Here's the IDE. There's the JPA metamodel. So what you need to do is you need to add a dependency to Hibernate's JPA model generator to your build process. And then Hibernate generates at build time the JPA metamodel classes. As you might guess from its name, that's part of the JPA specification. So you can also use it with Eclipse Link, OpenJPA, and all other things. Yeah, and these classes describe the entity class. So here we have the author class. It's a simple entity class, primary key attribute, version attribute, and then first name, last name, date of birth, just a few attributes. And if you look at the author underscore class, you can see here that you have an attribute for each attribute of your entity. And that these classes can then be used in your query to reference these entity attributes in a type-safe way. So that makes the whole implementation of your query easier, less error-prone, and also gives you a little bit better tuning when you want to refactor your entity. Author underscore JPA metamodel. Here's the entity class and all its attributes. You can use it to define type-safe queries or to implement in this post I use it to find type-safe queries. You can learn more about the JPA meta model here. I'm pretty sure I have an article about it. Let me quickly check. Meta model. Oh. Of course there's an article about it. There it is. Okay, so there were more questions in the chat. Just saw. Okay, so Shiv asks how to keep the comment feed separate and edit for each entity. I don't want to use Map superclass because it makes my class not extend from other classes. Field like is deleted, is current, start date, end date are common for most of the entities. Well, there's not a lot that you can do. You either introduce a superclass that defines these attributes and their mapping, or you need to add it manually to all of your entity classes. These are the only two things you can do with Java in general. If you decide to add these attributes to all your entity classes, then you could use a composite. A composite is basically a reusable piece of mapping information. So it's an additional class that is annotated with embeddable and that provides the entity map, a set of attributes and mapping annotations for each of them. And this embeddable becomes part of your entity. So the embeddable doesn't have a lifecycle on its own. It becomes part of the entity, gets persisted together with the entity and everything, and gets mapped to the same database table. So on the Java side, you see that all these attributes would be part of another class. But on the table, they would be, on the database side, they would be part of the same database table. Yeah, I don't really like using an embeddable in this case because putting is deleted, is current, start date, and end date into a different object that you include via composition into your entity, it just feels wrong. Yeah, the only alternative there would be to add all these fields to each entity class manually if you don't want to use inheritance. And I totally get it if you don't want to use inheritance. Well, you would be misusing inheritance if you introduced something that you see in a lot of projects, something like an abstract entity class or something like that, and that only defines these attributes, and all other entity classes extend that class just to get the these additional attribute mappings. But yeah, that are the limitations that we have in Java, right? We can only extend one superclass, and inheritance is the only way to really add attributes to your specific class if you don't define them for that class specifically. So not too much that you can do there. Hi Kiran, hi Matthias. Great to have you here, guys. Yeah, let's get to the. Let's get back to the questions here. So Simon asking about, can you explain below line in detail? Hibernate loads all associated entities when it initializes the association. Is it during Hibernate proxy or when fetching actual child? That is. I now map to many associated users. And as all associated entities when it initializes the association second. Yeah. So if you map an association with lots of elements, so I had it in a project several years ago where we modeled an association between a product and all sold instances of that product. And we modeled it in a bidirectional way. So that means if you got the product or one product entity object, you had a getter to get all sold instances of that product. That felt great during development, but it was a really bad idea because when you deploy that application to production and use it for a while, you might have a few million instances of sold products. And fetching all of them at once is a really bad idea because it just crashes and ends with timeout exception. So that is the thing that I try to explain here. If you model such an association and call the getter method, then Hibernate will fetch all the associated entities, at least if it's a lazily fetched association. So the thing that you're missing there is an option to reduce the amount of records that you want to fetch when you call the getter method. Because the association is implemented as a list or as a set, the only thing that Hibernate can do there is to fetch all of them. And that's just the wrong approach for huge associations. So let's get back down here to the initial question. Can you explain, is it during Hibernate proxy or when fetching actual child? That depends on the fetch type you define for the association. If you use fetch type eager, Hibernate fetches the association when it instantiates the entity object. This is not recommended. Because you will initialize the association even if you don't use it in your code. If you use fetch type lazy, Hibernate fetches the association when it instantiates, when you use it. This is much better because it avoids any unnecessary database queries, but it's still an issue for huge associations because Hibernate fetches all associated entities at once. For all too many associations, Hibernate does that using its own set or list implementation. For all to one associations, Hibernate instantiates a proxy object that triggers the required queries. Yeah, so an important difference between too one and too many associations that I mentioned here. So the question is always, how do you implement lazy loading if you're building a framework like Hibernate? If you want to have a transparent mechanism that performs the lazy loading, you need to either instantiate generate proxy classes that then get used to. Let me explain it differently. You have two options, and Hibernate uses both of them for different purposes. So for too-many associations, we model the association as a list or a set or a map. These are interfaces, and what Hibernate can do there is they can provide their own interface implementation, and that works totally fine. So Hibernate has its own list and set implementation and map, and when you have a lazy too-many association, Hibernate instantiates an object of its own interface implementation, uses it as the attribute value, and when you then call when you then use that list, set, or map implementation for the first time, Hibernate recognizes, okay, this one is a lazy association and I didn't get the data from the database yet, so we need to trigger a database query and get the data. That doesn't work for to-one associations because these are modeled with attributes of the type of the associated entity. So if we have an association between a book and a publisher, and there's only one publisher for book, then the book entity will have an attribute of type publisher, probably with the name publisher. And there we don't have an interface that Hibernate could implement. And that also wouldn't work because they would need to know all the entities that we might build at some point. That just doesn't work. So what the Hibernate team did there, and that's a pretty common approach, is they generate a subclass proxy of that entity. So in that case, they generate a class that extends the publisher entity class that we implemented, and that provides the lazy loading functionality. So that means if you get a book entity from the database and there's a lazy to-one association to the publisher, then Hibernate instantiates an object of its own or of its publisher subclass, puts it as the attribute value, and when we use the publisher object for the first time, then this generated subclass recognizes, okay, we didn't get the data yet, and this is the database query that needs to be triggered and perform that query. So yeah, the way that the lazy loading is implemented depends on the type of association that we have there. Okay. So Shiv asks how to keep each update of the entity history in table. That sounds like, yeah, that's the query that the question that you asked at the beginning of the stream, right? So please take a look at Hibernate Envers for that. Hibernate Envers is an extension to Hibernate that keeps an audit log. The general idea there is for each audited entity, Hibernate expects an additional audit table in which it documents all the changes performed on the entity objects of that type. So if we have an author entity, for example, we have an author table. The author entity gets mapped to the author table. That's the typical thing that we always have with Hibernate. If you add Hibernate Envers to the mix, then you also have a revision table and an author underscore AUD for audit table. So for each insert or update operation on the author entity, Hibernate will change or add the required record to the author table, and it will also create a revision a record in the revision table and a record in the author underscore out table. And there it documents the kind of operation that was performed and the values that were set on that record. And you can then use the query API included in Hibernate Envers to get the data from there. So Vishal asks, should I prefer denormalized data for avoiding join queries? Does it cause any performance issues? Well, denormalized data can be a good way to avoid performance problems because it can allow you to simplify the queries and pre-process some things that you otherwise would need to calculate in a query or in your business code. The important question there is, how do you keep the denormalized data in sync and up to date? And that is normally the issue with denormalized data. So when we start with databases, we normally learn that we need to normalize the data, remove redundancy, and so on. And that is a good thing to keep the database or the data in your database consistent and to avoid any update phenomena. And then later you sooner or later learn that, yeah, some form, at least some level of denormalization can make sense to speed up some operations. Yeah. So in general, denormalized data shouldn't cause any performance issues, but it might cause data inconsistencies. So better be careful about using it. So Iga asked, if I create a query with criteria API and use, for example, join, then I can use order by and sort using join get property. If I change join to fetch, then get is not available. So I have to cast fetch to join. Is it possible to sort using fetch without cast? Well, first of all, the cast from a fetch to a join is something that you should avoid in general for two reasons. First of all, it totally relies on an internal implementation detail of Hibernate. There is no association between the fetch and the join interface. The only thing that you're using there is that the class that implements the fetch interface in Hibernate is the same class that also implements the join interface. So you can cast it from one of its interfaces to the other. But if you do that, you need to be very careful, and you should never use it for the where clause, and you need to think about the order by clause or sorting. So why shouldn't you use it for where clauses first? The thing here is the join fetch clause extends your projection, so it extends the number of columns that get selected, and it adds a join to the from clause, which creates a product and returns more records. And this is done to get all the associated entities. Let's use an example. We have an author entity and we have a book entity. If we now select authors and do a join fetch on the book association, then we tell Hibernate, please fetch the authors that fulfill all the criteria in the where clause and return them with initialized lists of all their books. And that means for each author, Hibernate has to get all the books and then map them to book objects and put them into the list. So that happens if you're using a join fetch, and then you have a fetch interface in your criteria API. If you now take this fetch interface and cast it to a join, and then use it in your where clause, then you put some limitations on that join. So you could, for example, say, okay, select all authors and then do a join fetch from author to book, and in the where clause you cast the fetch interface of the book to a join interface and limit it to all books with a title that starts with Hibernate. Then your query would return all author entities that wrote a book about Hibernate with an initialized list of book entities. But the issue there is that list would only contain the entities that match your where criteria. And that's not what was intended with that query. You wanted to get all authors who wrote a book about Hibernate with all their books. And that is what Hibernate expects when you keep working with these entities. It expects that's a fully initialized list of associated entities. But you don't have that because you casted your fetch interface to a join interface. That means you have an incompletely initialized list of associated book entities, and that can lead to all kinds of issues. So now the question is, can you use it in the order by clause? Well, as I said at the beginning, I wouldn't recommend it because it relies on an implementation detail of Hibernate. But I guess that it at least wouldn't break. And I think it wouldn't break because you just changed the order of the records instead of limiting the number of records. Yeah, as you wrote in the chat, Igor, you still get all associated entities. So yeah, you can. Yeah, again, I wouldn't recommend it, but you can probably do it without breaking anything. At least as long as the Hibernate team doesn't decide to change the implementation of the criteria API and use two different classes to implement the join and the fetch interface. Besides that, it shouldn't break anything. Without the cast, you can't use the fetch interface to define your order by clause. The right way would be to do two joins. So the right way would be to join from the author to the book and to join fetch from the author to the book, because these are two different things. One is for the initialization of the association, so of your list of books on the author, that would be the join fetch. And the other thing is the join for the query itself, for the where clause, for the order by clause, and so on. So the totally correct and clean way would be to use two joins. But especially in this case, the performance of that query with two joins will not be as good as the dirty one that just casts the fetch to the join. Okay. Let's take a look at this Stack Overflow question, and then take a final look at the chat, answer the remaining question, and then we will end this stream in, let's say, 10-15 minutes probably. So let's take a look at this question here. I'm getting a lazy initialization exception when trying to access the permission collection on my user object, part of the user class. Okay, there we have the permissions. I'm calling get by username to receive the user from. Igor, no, JPQA wouldn't be necessarily the better choice there. there you would need to do the same approach. JPQL just makes it a little bit easier to mix up these two things and to create a query that's actually wrong. Okay, so that person here tries to get user entities and with a list of initialized permissions, and then access them after it closed. The session was closed. And he says you can't use fetch type eager, which you shouldn't use anyways, or fetch mode, because there are other associations. Okay. You should do 2 things to fix this exception. Three things, actually. Map all associations using fetch type lazy. Two, model your too many associations. Well, we have multiple options here, right? I mean, we could use, they're using a list as the user type for the permissions. You could use a set here, then you can use, and there as well. Then you can use multiple join fetches. You could also use multiple fetch type eagers, but explicitly recommend to not do that. So yeah, you could change the data type here from list to set. That would allow you multiple join fetch clauses. Or what you could do as well is you could trigger 2 queries, one that gets the user with a join fetch on the groups and one with a join fetch on the permissions. And then Hibernate would merge these results in memory. Two options to fix this exception. Could use multiple join fetch clauses to initialize all required associations. Or you could perform a query for each required association. Option 1, multiple join fetch clauses. For this option, you need to change the type of your too many associations to set instead of list. This prevents the multiple back fetch exception when fetching multiple too many associations. In the next step, you can use a query that join fetches each required association. e.g. select new from user u join fetch, probably a left join fetch u dot permissions, left join fetch u dot the other thing, groups. Option 2. This is a good approach. If you only fetch a few, if you only select a few user entities, and if your permissions and groups associations only contain a few entities. If the product created by your query is small. In this case, that means you only select a few user entities and your permissions and user group associations only contain a few entities. Groups. Okay. Option 2. Multiple queries. Hibernate ensures that there is only one entity object for that. Within a session, each database record gets mapped to only one entity object. So no matter how often you select the user entity with ID 1, Hibernate will only map it to 1. Will always map it to the same entity object. You can use that to initialize multiple associations without struggling with the multiple back fetch exception. From user you left join fetch you permissions, select you left join fetch you groups. In this example, you could perform 2 queries and get the same user entities with different associations. Get the first one gets user entities with user entities and initializes the permissions associations, and the second one gets user entities and initializes the groups associations. Okay. Yeah, developer's good. I'm sorry about the audio level. The microphone that I usually use broke a few minutes before the stream, and I had to improvise a little bit. So I'm using a different microphone today. Next time will be better for sure. Okay. Put another line break here and one down there. This is a piece of code. There's an all. Okay. Okay, do you have any questions about this answer here? So this is a pretty common scenario where we have multiple associations defined on an entity and we need to fetch all of them or at least more than one association for a specific use case. Then you always need to choose between using multiple join fetch clauses or using multiple queries. The issue with multiple join fetch clauses is that the product created by your query can get pretty huge. That depends on the number of elements in the associations. Because in the query here, where we use a left join fetch between the user and the permissions and the user and the groups, we get the user. We get a result set in which we have the as many records as a user multiplied by all its permissions multiplied by all its groups, because that's just how a relational query language works, right? So if you have a user who has 10 permissions and who is in 5 groups, then we will get 50 records for that user, and that pretty quickly becomes an issue because it requires a lot of resources on the database and on the on the network and in our Java code. In general, that's not a big deal if you have a 2-1 association. So if I have a book and I do a join fetch on the authors and the publisher association, then the second join fetch to the publisher will not be a big deal because it just adds these few columns from the publisher, because there's only one publisher for each book. So there you could easily use a multiple join fetch clauses. In the example here with users and permissions, maybe not. It's hard to answer without knowing the actual data they are working with and without having more details on that project. So yeah, I will add a few links to this question after the stream. And oh, I'm sorry, I didn't share my screen with you, right? So yeah, you can take a look at the answer that I just wrote here, and I will take another look at Igor's question. Yeah, Igor, you're right. You can easily write a join fetch clause in JPQL and use the association then in all other parts of the query. but that only resides in one join clause in your SQL statement. But that doesn't avoid the issue that the join that you do to that the join fetch is intended to fetch all associated records for the initialization of the association, of the mapped association. And this might be okay if you just use it to sort the records in your reside set, but it's definitely not a good approach if you want to implement or if you want to add any where conditions for that query. So yeah, the JPQA query makes it a little bit easier to implement this query, let's say at least in a dirty way, and quite often to even break it without recognizing it. Yeah. So in general, join fetch or all associations that are part of a join fetch clause should be joined again if you want to use them in any other part of the query. Okay. Any other question? If not, I would say that's it for today. I will speak for a few more minutes. So if you have a question, then please post it to the chat now. In the meantime, I will talk a little bit about the next 2 weeks. Unfortunately, next week we need to skip the Coffee with Thorben live stream. I will be hosting a customer workshop, and well, I'm basically doing an in-house workshop from Tuesday morning till Thursday afternoon. So at this time next week, I will be teaching, and I'm not able to do the stream. And to be honest, after hosting a workshop for a full day, it's probably not a good idea to jump on a stream and answer more questions in the evening. I will need some time to recover from the stream there, from the workshop. But the week after, I have great news. Michael Simons will join me, and we will talk about Neo4j, their new Spring component, working from home, mental health when working from home, and all these kind of things. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I hope you're interested as well, and join us for that stream. It will be on the 3rd of June, so today in 2 weeks. Okay, then I didn't saw any additional questions here in the chat. That means I will wrap this one up here. Thanks for joining. Thanks for asking all these questions. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope the audio was okay. I read in the chat that someone said it was a little bit low. I hope I find a way to fix the microphone, because my good old Rode Podcaster that really worked well for a few years seems to be pretty hard to get right now. I'm not sure if that's still available on the market. Yeah, but anyways, until the next stream in 2 weeks, I will find a solution that hopefully works a little bit better. Okay, then take care, stay healthy, and we see each other in 2 weeks. Bye.